"I'll make sure you're homeless by Christmas," my landlord smirked, leaning against my doorframe. "Someone like you can't afford a lawyer anyway." Little did he know, I'd been recording every conversation for months. 3 weeks later, as he sat sweating in front of the housing tribunal, I watched his face crumble when I pulled out the evidence that would not only save my home, but cost him thousands. It started on an ordinary Tuesday in September. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, sorting through bills, trying to figure out which ones I could pay now and which would have to wait until my next paycheck. The apartment wasn't much. A one-bedroom with water stains on the ceiling and a bathroom door that never quite closed properly. But it was all I could afford on my warehouse salary, and it had been home for nearly 4 years. A sharp knock interrupted my calculations. 3 rapid hits, too aggressive for a friend. When I opened the door, Richard Keller, my landlord, stood there with a manila folder tucked under his arm. I'd always found him slightly off-putting. A man in his 50s, with slicked back hair and shirts unbuttoned 1 button too many, revealing a gold chain that caught the light when he moved. But today, something was different. His smile was too wide, his eyes too bright. "Mike, good to see you," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He'd never been good to see me before. In 4 years, he'd only visited twice. Once when the bathroom ceiling collapsed, and once to tell me the rent was going up. "How's everything going?" "Fine," I said, closing the door behind him. "Is there a problem?" "Problem? No problem." He looked around my apartment with exaggerated interest, nodding at my second-hand furniture like he was appraising it. "Actually, I've got some news. The building's undergoing some changes." He pulled papers from his folder and laid them on my kitchen table, right on top of my bills. "We're doing major renovations, comprehensive stuff. The whole building needs to be emptied for at least 6 months. I picked up the notice. "Eviction?" "Temporary relocation," he corrected, still smiling. "You'll need to be out by December 1st. "But that's less than 3 months from now. And where am I supposed to go?" He shrugged, spreading his hands in a gesture of helplessness that didn't match the gleam in his eyes. "Not my problem, technically. But I'm giving you a heads up, which is more than I'm required to do." Something felt wrong. Richard had never spent money on this building if he could avoid it. The broken intercom had been temporarily out of order for 2 years. The washing machines in the basement had been getting fixed next month since I moved in. "What kind of renovations?" I asked. "Everything. Electrical, plumbing, structural. Place needs to be gutted." He tapped the paper. "It's all in there. You've got until December 1st. As he turned to leave, I noticed a real estate brochure sticking out of his folder. Just a glimpse, but enough to see luxury apartments and what looked like a computer rendering of our building with a sleek new facade. After he left, I read the notice carefully. It mentioned necessary renovations, but it was vague on details. It stated I had to vacate, but said nothing about returning. And most importantly, it had no official letterhead, no permit numbers, no contact information for any construction company. I called the city's building department the next day. There were no permits filed for our address, no renovations scheduled, nothing. That weekend, I saw Richard showing a young couple around the building. They were well-dressed, carrying coffee from the expensive cafe down the street. Through my cracked window, I heard fragments. Completely renovated by spring, and double the square footage if we combine units. I understood then. This wasn't about renovations. This was about getting rid of tenants with old leases so we could renovate cheaply and rent at much higher prices in our increasingly trendy neighborhood. I'd seen it happen to other buildings on my street. The next week, the water in my apartment was shut off without warning. When I called Richard, he sounded annoyed. "Probably part of the pre-renovation assessment. Should be back on soon." "There are no renovations scheduled," I said flatly. "I checked with the city." A pause. Then, "Look, Mike, I'm trying to be nice about this. The building's old. Things break. If it's too inconvenient, maybe take it as a sign to start looking for a new place early." The water came back on 8 hours later. 2 days after that, the heat went out. Then the hallway lights. Each time, Richard had the same response. Not his fault. Just old systems failing. Maybe I should consider moving sooner rather than later. I started documenting everything, every conversation, every maintenance issue, every day, without basic services. I took photos of the mold growing in my bathroom because the ventilation suddenly stopped working. I recorded the temperature in my apartment when the heat was out, 52 degrees. I also started recording our conversations. In my state, only one party needs to consent to a recording, and I definitely consented. I kept my phone in my shirt pocket, voice memo running, every time we spoke. By early October, things escalated. Richard sent a maintenance worker who spent hours drilling and hammering in the vacant apartment above mine during the exact hours I told Richard I worked night shifts and slept during the day. When I complained, Richard just shrugged. Building improvements? Can't be helped. Then came the notices under my door. Warnings about violations of my lease. Complaints about noise that never happened. Claims that I was keeping unauthorized pets when I didn't have so much as a goldfish. Each notice threatened eviction if the problems continued. I kept documenting. I asked neighbors to write statements confirming I wasn't noisy. I took dated photos of my pet-free apartment. I saved every notice, every text, every email. In late October, Richard cornered me in the hallway as I was leaving for work. His friendly facade had dropped entirely. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, blocking my path. "Everyone else has agreed to leave." This was a lie. I'd spoken to Mrs. Castillo in 3B, who had lived there for 20 years and had no intention of leaving. Same with the Pattersons in 2A. "I have a lease," I said. "It's valid until next August." He stepped closer. "Leases can be broken, especially when tenants violate the terms. Like having all those parties people keep complaining about." "There haven't been any parties?" "Your word against mine. And who do you think they'll believe? The property owner or the guy who can barely make rent each month?" I felt my face flush, but I kept my voice steady. "Is that a threat?" "It's reality. I'll make sure you're homeless by Christmas. Someone like you can't afford a lawyer anyway." He smiled, showing too many teeth. "Be smart, Mike. Start packing." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because I was angry. I'd worked hard for this crappy apartment. I paid my rent on time, even when it meant eating ramen for a week. I followed the rules, and now Richard thought he could just throw me out because someone with more money wanted my space. The next day, instead of going to work, I called in sick and went to the local tenants' rights office. It was a small place, just 2 rooms and a community center. But the woman who greeted me, Elena, had the steady confidence of someone who'd seen it all before. I showed her my documentation, played a few of the recordings, and explained the situation. With each piece of evidence, her expression grew more determined. "This is textbook harassment," she said when I finished. "He's trying to constructively evict you, make living conditions so unbearable that you leave voluntarily. So what can I do? Document everything, which you're already doing. File a formal complaint with the housing authority, and if he tries to evict you, contest it. With this evidence, he doesn't have a case." She paused. "But there's something else you might consider." She explained that in cases of clear landlord harassment, tenants could file for damages, not just stopping the eviction, but potentially receiving compensation for the harassment. "It's not about the money," she assured me. "It's about consequences. Landlords do this because it usually works and costs them nothing. If it starts costing them, they think twice." For the next 2 weeks, the harassment continued. The elevator was suddenly broken. Inconvenient for everyone, but especially for Mrs. Castillo with her arthritis. The garbage wasn't collected. A mysterious leak appeared in my ceiling, and Richard took 3 days to send someone to look at it. Each incident went into my documentation. Each conversation was recorded. I filed my complaint with the housing authority and, on Elena's advice, sent Richard a formal letter stating that I was aware of my rights and would not be vacating my apartment. His response came in the form of an official-looking eviction notice, citing noise complaints and unauthorized alterations to the property, a complete fabrication. The notice gave me 30 days to vacate. I contested it immediately and requested a hearing with the local housing tribunal. Richard seemed delighted when he was notified about the hearing. He probably thought it would be his word against mine, and he'd win easily. The day before the hearing, I ran into him in the lobby. He was wearing an expensive-looking suit and checking his watch impatiently. "Looking forward to tomorrow," he said with a smirk. "Brought my lawyer. Hope you've got a good one, too." "Oh, wait, you can't afford one, can you?" I just nodded politely and continued to my apartment. I didn't tell him that Elena from the tenants' rights office would be accompanying me, or that the housing tribunal didn't require lawyers. It was designed to be accessible to people without legal representation. The tribunal was held in a small room at the county courthouse. 3 people sat at a table at the front: a retired judge, a housing authority representative, and a community member. Richard sat on one side with a young man in an equally expensive suit. I sat on the other with Elena. Richard spoke first, painting a picture of me as a problem tenant: noisy, destructive, uncooperative. His lawyer presented the noise complaints and photographs of damage to my apartment that I'd never seen before. Furthermore, Richard concluded, Mr. Harlow was informed months ago about necessary renovations requiring all tenants to vacate. Everyone else has cooperated. He's the only one being difficult. When it was my turn, I started quietly. I've lived in apartment 2C for 4 years. I paid my rent on time. I've been a good neighbor. I'd like to present some evidence. I handed the tribunal members my documentation, photos, dated notes, statements from neighbors. Then I pulled out my phone. I also have recordings of my conversations with Mr. Keller. Richard's smirk faltered. Recordings? That's illegal. You can't record people without their knowledge. The retired judge looked at him. Actually, in this state, single-party consent is all that's required. If Mr. Harlow was part of the conversation, he can record it legally. She nodded at me. Proceed. I played the recordings. Richard threatening to make me homeless by Christmas. Richard admitting there were no real noise complaints. Richard bragging about how he was going to convert the building into luxury units and get rid of the working-class deadweight. With each recording, Richard's face grew redder. His lawyer whispered urgently to him, but Richard pushed him away. Those are taken out of context, he interrupted. He's twisting my words. Would you like to provide the context, Mr. Keller? The housing authority representative asked. Richard fumbled, contradicted himself, then finally snapped. Look, the building needs renovations. That's just business. Then you should have filed for permits, I said, sliding forward the letter from the building department confirming no permits had been requested. And followed the legal process for necessary renovations, which includes a right to return for current tenants. The tribunal members conferred briefly. Then the retired judge spoke. Based on the evidence presented, we find no grounds for eviction. Furthermore, the actions of the landlord constitute harassment under city housing codes. She turned to Richard. The eviction notice is invalidated. Mr. Harlow's lease remains in effect. Additionally, Mr. Keller, you are ordered to cease all harassment immediately and restore all services to the building. Richard stood up, face contorted with anger. This is ridiculous. It's my building. Yes, the judge replied calmly. And with ownership comes legal responsibilities. You failed to meet them. Mr. Harlow has also filed a civil complaint for damages related to the harassment, which will be heard separately. I suggest you consult with your lawyer about that. Richard stormed out, his lawyer hurrying after him. Elena squeezed my arm and whispered, Well done. But it wasn't over. The next day, Richard shut off the water again. When I called, he didn't answer. I documented it, reported it to the housing authority, and they sent an emergency inspector who turned it back on and fined Richard for non-compliance with the tribunal's order. 2 days later, I received a notice that Richard was selling the building. A week after that, representatives from a management company visited, explaining they were assessing the property for potential purchase. One of them, a woman named Sarah, asked to speak with me privately. We've reviewed the records for this building, including recent tribunal findings, she said. We understand you've had difficulties with the current owner. I nodded cautiously. Our company believes in following housing laws and maintaining good relationships with tenants, she continued. If we purchase this building, we'd honor all existing leases and address the maintenance issues that have been neglected. She handed me her card. If Mr. Keller continues to violate the tribunal's orders, please let me know. It affects our assessment of the property's liabilities. Over the next month, things changed dramatically. Richard was rarely seen at the building. The heat worked consistently. The garbage was collected. The elevator was repaired. It seemed Richard didn't want to give the management company any more reasons to lower their offer. In December, when I was supposed to be homeless, according to Richard's threat, I attended the hearing for my harassment claim. Richard didn't show up. Only his lawyer appeared. The judge awarded me 3 months' rent as damages for the harassment, plus attorney's fees, which went to the tenants' rights organization. 2 weeks before Christmas, the sale of the building was finalized. The management company sent all tenants a letter introducing themselves, confirming our leases would be honored, and outlining plans for gradual, occupied renovations over the next year. I ran into Mrs. Castillo in the hallway after the letters arrived. She was smiling for the first time in months. "You did this," she said, patting my hand. "You stood up to him when the rest of us were too scared." "We all did our part," I replied, thinking of her witness statement that had been part of my evidence. "You've lived here 20 years. You deserve to stay if you want to." "So do you," she said firmly. On Christmas Eve, I came home to find a small package outside my door. Inside was a new set of keys and a note from the management company, explaining they'd changed the locks on all exterior doors as part of their security upgrade. I stood in my kitchen, holding those keys. The same kitchen where Richard had first delivered his fake eviction notice. The same table where I'd sorted bills and worried about making rent. The same apartment he'd been so certain he could take from me. I wasn't homeless by Christmas. Instead, I had a more secure home than before. In January, I saw Richard one last time. He was walking out of the real estate office down the street as I was passing by. He looked smaller somehow, his expensive coat hanging loosely as if he'd lost weight. When he saw me, he froze. I could have said something cutting. I could have reminded him of his failed threat. I could have asked how it felt to lose. Instead, I just nodded politely and continued walking. I didn't need to say anything. The keys in my pocket said it all. Over the next year, the management company made good on their promises. They fixed the persistent issues in the building while allowing tenants to stay in place. When my lease came up for renewal, there was a modest increase, reasonable for the neighborhood and the improvements made. I still live in that apartment. Sometimes when I unlock my door, I remember Richard's smirk when he thought he had all the power. I remember the fear I felt, not knowing if I could fight back. And I remember the moment in the tribunal when I realized that documentation, knowledge, and truth were more powerful than his money and connections. The manila folder with all my evidence still sits on my top shelf. I keep it as a reminder that standing up for yourself matters, that preparation beats intimidation, and that sometimes the person who seems to hold all the cards is just bluffing. Every so often, someone in the building faces an issue with management, a repair not completed, a question about the lease, a misunderstanding about rules. They often come to me for advice. I help them document. I help them understand their rights. I help them communicate effectively. Last month, Mrs. Castillo's granddaughter moved in with her to help with her care. The management company initially questioned whether this violated occupancy rules. I helped Mrs. Castillo write a formal request for a reasonable accommodation under fair housing laws. It was approved within a week. "I couldn't have done this before," she told me afterward. "I would have been too afraid of ending up homeless." "That's how they win," I replied. "They count on fear." But fear is harder to maintain when you know your rights, when you keep records, when you find allies, and when you've seen that standing up can work. Richard taught me that, though not in the way he intended. I still sort bills at my kitchen table. I still budget carefully. I still work at the warehouse. But now, when I look around my small apartment, I don't just see what I can barely afford. I see what I fought for and won. I see proof that sometimes, even when the odds seem stacked against you, justice is possible. And on the hook by my door hang my keys, not just to my apartment, but to the knowledge that no one can easily take your home away when you know how to defend it.